Good evening. Tonight we begin with something that sits on nearly every dinner table, every celebration, every ritual of human gathering, yet hides within it one of history's darkest shadows. This is the complete history of illicit alcohol, the toxic twin of civilization's most ancient intoxicant, a substance that has killed more people than most wars, blinded more souls than most plagues, and destroyed more families than most tyrants could ever manage. Forget the romantic tales of moonshiners outwitting revenuers in the Appalachian Hills, the glamorous speakeasies of the Roaring Twenties with their jazz and sequins. The real story is far grimmer, far more complex and far more persistent than any Hollywood version could capture. This is a tale that spans every continent and every century since humans first discovered fermentation, from ancient Mesopotamian taverns serving adulterated beer to modern methanol disasters in Iran and India. From medieval poisoners using tainted wine as murder weapons to Prohibition-era gangsters shipping industrial alcohol relabeled as whiskey, knowing full well it would blind and kill their customers. It's a story of desperation and greed, of governments trying to control what cannot be controlled, of chemistry weaponized against the poor, of profits extracted from human misery. The truth is, if you were dropped into any chapter of illicit alcohol's shadow history, whether in a medieval monastery where monks watered down sacramental wine to sell the surplus, in a Prohibition-era warehouse where industrial poison was being redistilled into something drinkable, or in a modern slum where methanol is sold as vodka because it's cheaper and the police look the other way, you would quickly see how thin the membrane is between civilization and barbarism, between commerce and murder, between social ritual and social catastrophe. You would see how prohibition creates crime, how regulation creates black markets, how poverty creates desperation, and how desperation creates victims. You would see that the history of illicit alcohol is not really about alcohol at all. It's about power and its absence, about wealth and its distribution, about the eternal human drive to alter consciousness, and the eternal drive of others to profit from that desire. Before we begin this journey through distilleries and speakeasies, through poisoned wells and criminal empires, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely find value in what we explore here. And please tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is there. I'm always fascinated by the global reach of these stories, by the fact that people from Mumbai to Mexico City, from Lagos to Los Angeles, are all grappling with the same questions about prohibition, regulation, and the impossible task of legislating human desire. Now, dim the lights, silence your phone and prepare yourself. This is not a gentle tale. This is a history written in blindness and death, in criminal fortunes and shattered lives, in policy failures and human resilience. This is the story of what happens when humanity's oldest social lubricant becomes humanity's deadliest poison. Let's step into this dark, necessary, and ultimately revealing story together. The story begins not in the criminal underworld, not in the basement laboratories of Prohibition-era America, but in the very cradle of civilization itself, in the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt, where humans first discovered that if you left certain fruits and grains in water long enough, something magical happened. The liquid would bubble and froth, and when you drank it, the world became softer, warmer, more bearable. The anxieties of agricultural life, the constant threat of famine and invasion, the grinding monotony of survival, all of it would fade into a pleasant haze. Fermentation was not invented. It was discovered, probably by accident, probably many times in many places. A jar of grain left in the rain, dates stored too long in a clay pot, honey mixed with water and forgotten. And in each case wild yeasts floating invisibly in the air would land in the mixture, consume the sugars, and excrete alcohol. It was, in its way, a miracle. The ancient Sumerians, writing on clay tablets in cuneiform script that we can still read today after 4,000 years, had a goddess specifically for beer, Ninkasi, they called her, the lady who fills the mouth. They had a hymn to her that was also a recipe, a set of instructions for brewing that doubled as religious poetry. The Egyptians, practical and organized as always, included beer in the daily rations for pyramid workers. Not as a luxury, but as nutrition, as hydration safer than the Nile water that carried disease. The alcohol content was low, the nutritional value genuine. It was, in a very real sense, liquid bread. Wine appeared later, more prestigious, more complex to produce, requiring the cultivation of specific grape varieties, and the patience to let the juice ferment properly. The Persians elevated it to an art form. The Greeks made it central to their symposia. their philosophical drinking parties, where men reclined on couches and debated the nature of reality while steadily getting drunk. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn, because wherever there is demand, there is someone willing to cut corners to increase supply. Wherever there is profit, there is someone willing to maximize that profit by any means necessary. And wherever there is regulation, there is someone willing to evade it. The ancient world had its adulterators, its fraudsters, its poisoners. Roman writers complained bitterly about tavern keepers who watered down wine, who added seawater to increase volume, who used lead acetate to sweeten sour wine, not knowing or not caring that lead was a cumulative poison that would slowly destroy the nervous systems of their customers. Pliny the Elder, that great encyclopedist of the 1st century, who died investigating the eruption of Vesuvius, devoted considerable space in his natural history to the problem of wine fraud. He described how dishonest merchants would mix wines from different regions, how they would add chalk and marble dust to make thin wine appear thicker, how they would use aloes and other bitter substances to mimic the astringency of aged wine. He described, though he didn't understand the chemistry, how some of these additives could cause illness, how customers would suffer headaches, nausea, blindness. The medieval period brought new sophistication to both legitimate brewing and criminal adulteration. Monasteries became the great centers of brewing knowledge, not out of any love of intoxication, but because beer was safer than water, and because selling surplus beer could fund the monastery's charitable works. The monks developed new techniques, new recipes, new standards of purity. They understood, in their empirical way, that cleanliness mattered, that water quality mattered, that the temperature of fermentation mattered. But outside the monastery walls, in the secular taverns and alehouses that served the common people, standards were far lower. Medieval brewing was largely a cottage industry, carried out by women in their homes, and the product varied wildly in quality and safety. Aloe, unhopped and unfiltered, would sour quickly in warm weather. Unscrupulous brewers would sell sour ale anyway, sometimes adding substances to mask the taste. The medieval lists of prohibited additives read like a catalogue of desperation and cruelty. Municipal records from London, from Paris, from the trading cities of the Hanseatic League, are filled with prosecutions for ale fraud. Brewers caught adding toxic substances to their product. Tavern keepers caught watering down beer to increase profits. The punishments were severe because the crime was seen as a kind of murder, a betrayal of the most basic social trust. You were literally poisoning your neighbors for money. In some jurisdictions, convicted adulterators were forced to drink their own product. In others, they were banned from the trade entirely, their brewing equipment destroyed, their names posted publicly as a warning to others. The problem was enforcement. How do you regulate thousands of small producers, each brewing in their own home, each selling to their own small circle of customers? How do you distinguish between honest brewing that happened to go wrong and deliberate poisoning for profit? The medieval solution was a combination of guild regulations, municipal inspections and community oversight. Alewives, as female brewers were called, would hang a sign outside their homes when a new batch was ready, and official ale tasters would come to test it before it could be sold. These were not ceremonial positions. The ale tasters were answerable to the community, and if they passed bad ale, they would be held responsible. But systems of oversight are only as good as the people running them, and corruption was endemic. An ale taster who could be bribed would look the other way. A brewer with connections to local power could avoid prosecution. And always, there was the fundamental economic logic that drives adulteration in every era. If you can make your product more cheaply by cutting corners, and if enforcement is weak or inconsistent, then the economic incentive is to cheat. The honest brewers, producing quality product at higher cost, would be undercut by the dishonest ones, and eventually quality itself would become unsustainable. The introduction of hops to European brewing in the medieval period changed the equation somewhat. Hops acted as a preservative, allowing beer to be stored longer and transported farther. This meant that brewing could become more centralized, more professional, more subject to regulation. The great brewing cities of Bavaria developed strict purity laws, the Reinheitsgebot, that specified exactly what could go into beer: only water, barley, and hops. Later, when yeast was understood, yeast was added to the list. Anything else was forbidden. These purity laws were not primarily about health. They were about economic control, about preventing brewers from using wheat and rye that were needed for bread, about maintaining quality standards that would protect the reputation of German beer in international markets. but they had the side effect of reducing adulteration, because the simpler the recipe, the harder it is to cheat. You can't add toxic substitutes if the law specifies exactly what ingredients are allowed, and inspectors check your supply chains. Yet even in Germany, even under the strict Reinheitsgebot, there were violations. There were always violations. Because the fundamental dynamic never changed, the demand for alcohol was constant, the profit margins were substantial, and the temptation to increase those margins by any means necessary was overwhelming. As European powers began their colonial expansions, they brought alcohol with them, both as a trade good and as a tool of conquest. The Spanish introduced distillation to the New World, a technology that had come to Europe from the Islamic world, where it had been developed for making perfumes and medicines, not intoxicants, since alcohol consumption was forbidden by religious law. Distillation was a revelation. By heating fermented liquid and capturing the vapors, you could concentrate the alcohol to astonishing levels. Where beer might be 4 or 5% alcohol and wine 10 or 12, distilled spirits could be 40, 50, even 60%. The effect on the drinker was proportionally more intense. A small volume could produce profound intoxication. This made spirits easier to transport, more profitable to trade, and far more dangerous to consume, especially for populations with no cultural experience of such concentrated intoxicants. The impact on indigenous populations in the Americas, in Africa, in the Pacific, was catastrophic. European traders used alcohol as a currency, as a tool of negotiation, as a deliberate instrument of social disruption. They traded spirits for furs, for land rights, for labor. They encouraged dependence, knowing that dependent populations were easier to exploit, and they cared nothing for the quality of what they traded. The alcohol sold to indigenous peoples was often the worst sort, adulterated with anything that would increase volume or decrease cost. Records from the fur trade in North America describe alcohol so adulterated it was barely recognizable as spirits. Traders would start with raw industrial alcohol, meant for lamps and cleaning, not consumption. They would dilute it with water to increase volume, then add substances to restore color and burn. Tobacco juice, molasses, chili peppers, strychnine in tiny amounts, to create a physical reaction that mimicked the burn of strong liquor. The result was a toxic soup that caused immediate illness and long-term damage. Indigenous leaders petitioned colonial authorities to stop the alcohol trade. They described in heartbreaking detail how their communities were being destroyed, how young men were dying, how violence and despair were spreading. The authorities, when they responded at all, would make token gestures toward regulation, but the trade continued because it was too profitable to stop. The alcohol traders were often the same merchants and officials who controlled the colonial economy. They were not going to regulate themselves out of business. This pattern, established in the colonial period, would repeat throughout the history of illicit alcohol: a vulnerable population, a profitable product, a regulatory apparatus captured by commercial interests, and a resulting public health catastrophe that authorities acknowledge but do nothing meaningful to prevent. The indigenous peoples of the Americas were among the first victims of this dynamic, but they would be far from the last. By the 18th century, Europe itself was experiencing its own alcohol crisis, particularly in England, where the rise of cheap gin was devastating urban populations. Gin, distilled from grain and flavored with juniper and other botanicals, was easy to produce and sell. The government had encouraged domestic spirits production as a way to use surplus grain and reduce dependence on imported brandy from France, with whom England was perpetually at war. The result was a glut of cheap gin flooding into London and other cities, sold from street vendors, from cellar shops, from any shabby room that could fit a barrel and a dipper. The famous engravings by Hogarth, Beer Street and Gin Lane, captured the perceived contrast. Beer Street was prosperous, orderly, healthy. Gin Lane was chaos, degradation, death. A mother so drunk she drops her child from a balcony. A carpenter pawning his tools for another drink. Bodies piled in cellars, children starving in the streets. The images were propaganda, certainly, but they reflected a genuine crisis. Gin consumption in London in the 1740s reached extraordinary levels, perhaps 2 gallons per person per year for the entire population, including children. The quality of this gin was often atrocious. Legitimate distillers produced decent product, but the market was flooded with cheap imitations made in backyard stills, adulterated with sulfuric acid to create the burn of strong spirits, sweetened with sugar to mask the taste of impurities. The effects were immediate and visible: widespread public drunkenness, an epidemic of child neglect, rising crime rates, shortened lifespans. Contemporary observers described the slums of London as scenes from hell, and gin was the devil's instrument. Parliament attempted to regulate the gin trade through a series of laws, the Gin Acts, that imposed licensing requirements and taxes, meant to make gin more expensive and reduce consumption. The results were mixed at best. High taxes just created a black market. Strict licensing just meant that gin was sold illegally from unlicensed premises. The gin palaces, legal establishments that sold spirits in relatively controlled environments, were replaced by gin cellars and backroom operations, where quality control was non-existent and adulteration was endemic. It took decades for the gin crisis to subside, and when it did, it was not primarily because of law enforcement. It was because economic conditions changed, because other forms of entertainment became available, because social reform movements convinced enough people that the costs of mass drunkenness exceeded any benefits. The crisis left a legacy, though a deep suspicion of spirits, a sense that distilled alcohol was inherently more dangerous than beer or wine, and a recognition that when alcohol is cheap and regulation is weak, the poor suffer most. This recognition would shape alcohol policy for the next 2 centuries. It would inform the temperance movements that arose in Britain and America in the 19th century, the push for prohibition that would culminate in the disastrous experiment of the 1920s, and the modern regulatory frameworks that try to balance personal freedom with public health. But we're getting ahead of the story. Before we reach prohibition, we need to understand the scientific revolution in chemistry that made truly dangerous alcohol adulteration possible. Because the gin crisis of 18th century London, as bad as it was nothing compared to what would come when industrial chemistry gave producers access to substances that could kill in tiny doses, that could blind permanently, that could destroy organs with a single drink. The history of illicit alcohol is in large part the history of these poisons, of how they entered the supply, why they were used, and what they did to the people who consumed them unknowingly. Methanol, wood alcohol, is the villain of this next chapter. It's a simple molecule, chemically similar to ethanol, the alcohol humans have been drinking for millennia, but with one critical difference: where ethanol is metabolized by the liver into relatively harmless compounds, methanol is metabolized into formaldehyde and formic acid, both of which are extremely toxic. Even small amounts of methanol can cause blindness by destroying the optic nerve. Larger amounts cause metabolic acidosis, organ failure, death. Methanol occurs naturally in tiny amounts in fermented beverages, produced as a byproduct when pectin from fruit breaks down. The amounts are too small to cause harm, because they're overwhelmed by the much larger amounts of ethanol, which the liver processes preferentially. But when methanol is consumed in concentrated form, or when it's the primary alcohol in a beverage, the results are catastrophic. The problem is that methanol is cheap. It's produced industrially in huge quantities for use as a solvent, as antifreeze, as fuel, and to the untrained eye, to the unsuspecting drinker, it's almost indistinguishable from ethanol. It's clear, it burns, it has a similar smell. If you're a criminal looking to make fake vodka or fake whiskey, and you can buy industrial methanol for a fraction of the price of ethanol, the economic logic is clear. Mix it with water, add some flavoring, put it in a bottle with a counterfeit label, and sell it. Your customers won't know the difference until it's too late. The first major industrial methanol poisoning in modern history occurred during Prohibition in the United States, though it wasn't the result of bootleggers mixing methanol into their product. It was the result of government policy. The story is so darkly absurd, it's worth telling in detail. Deva Matera Kujis, Kailda 20 bin character. The United States government, in its zealous effort to enforce prohibition, made a decision that would kill thousands of its own citizens. It was a decision made in frustration, made with full knowledge of the consequences, and defended publicly, even as the bodies piled up. This is not speculation or conspiracy theory. This is documented historical fact, preserved in government memos, congressional testimony, and newspaper reports that contemporary readers found almost impossible to believe. The problem facing prohibition enforcers was simple: industrial alcohol was still legal. Manufacturers needed it for countless legitimate purposes, from making varnish and antifreeze to producing pharmaceuticals and perfumes. Millions of gallons were produced annually, all of it chemically identical to drinking alcohol. The government's solution was to require that all industrial alcohol be denatured, made undrinkable by adding poisonous substances. At first the denaturants were merely unpleasant, foul-tasting chemicals that would cause vomiting, but not death. Bootleggers quickly learned to redistill the alcohol, removing most of the denaturants, or to use activated charcoal to filter them out. The government responded by requiring stronger denaturants, ones that couldn't be easily removed. And when bootleggers found ways around those, the government made a fateful decision. They would add poisons so deadly that no amount of redistillation could make the alcohol safe. The formula varied over the years, but by the mid-1920s, industrial alcohol was being denatured with a cocktail of toxins that included methanol, kerosene, gasoline, benzene, cadmium, zinc, mercury salts, nicotine, ether, formaldehyde, chloroform, camphor, carbolic acid, quinine, and acetone. The quantities of methanol were particularly high, often 10% or more of the total volume. This was not accidental contamination. This was deliberate poisoning, mandated by federal regulation, enforced by federal inspectors. The logic, such as it was, went like this. If industrial alcohol was deadly, bootleggers wouldn't steal it, wouldn't try to redistill it, wouldn't sell it. The poisoning would stop the black market at its source. What actually happened was entirely predictable to anyone who understood basic economics or human nature. Bootleggers stole the industrial alcohol anyway. They sold it anyway. Sometimes they made token efforts to redistill it, but often they didn't bother. They just relabeled it and sold it as whiskey, or gin, or whatever the market wanted. And people died. They died in numbers that are still difficult to comprehend. The official death toll from poisoned alcohol during Prohibition is usually given as around 10,000, but historians believe the true number was much higher, because many deaths were misattributed to other causes, because poor and immigrant communities were undercounted, because families hid deaths to avoid scandal or legal complications. On New Year's Eve 1926 alone, in New York City, 41 people died from poisoned alcohol. By New Year's Day the count was 63. The hospitals were overwhelmed with victims suffering blindness, paralysis, organ failure. The medical details are horrific. Methanol poisoning follows a characteristic pattern. First, there's the initial intoxication, indistinguishable from ethanol drunkenness. The victim feels dizzy, euphoric, unsteady. Then 6 to 30 hours later, as the methanol metabolizes, the real symptoms begin. Severe headache, nausea and vomiting, abdominal pain, blurred vision, or the sensation of looking through a snowstorm. Then, if the dose was high enough, blindness as the optic nerves die, seizures, coma, death. The treatment, ironically, is ethanol, real drinking alcohol. Because the liver processes ethanol preferentially, flooding the system with ethanol prevents the methanol from being metabolized into its toxic byproducts. Doctors during Prohibition knew this. They would force whiskey down the throats of poisoning victims, trying to save their lives with the very substance that Prohibition had made illegal. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. The damage was too severe, or the treatment came too late, or the victim had consumed so much methanol that no amount of ethanol could prevent the metabolic catastrophe. The government's response to these mass poisonings was not to change policy, it was to blame the victims. Prohibition officials gave press conferences, explaining that anyone who drank illegal alcohol was taking their life in their hands, that the government had done everything possible to make industrial alcohol undrinkable, that the real criminals were the bootleggers who sold poison, not the government that mandated the poison in the first place. When critics pointed out that the government was essentially executing people without trial for the crime of wanting a drink, officials responded that the purpose of denaturants was deterrence, and that if people died, it proved the deterrence was working. This reasoning, circular and monstrous, was surprisingly effective with a certain segment of the public. The same moral absolutism that had made Prohibition possible in the first place made it possible to justify any measure, no matter how extreme, in Prohibition's defense. If drinking alcohol was a sin, a crime, a threat to the social order, then people who drank deserved whatever happened to them. That many of the victims were poor, were immigrants, were from communities already marginalized, only made it easier to dismiss their deaths as the natural consequences of vice. But not everyone accepted this logic. The medical profession was nearly unanimous in condemning the policy. The American Medical Association passed resolutions demanding that the government stop adding poisons to industrial alcohol. Individual physicians wrote scathing editorials in medical journals. One doctor, writing in the Journal of the American Medical Association, called the denaturing program legalized murder and predicted accurately that it would kill more Americans than all the gangster violence of the Prohibition era combined. Progressive reformers, many of whom had initially supported prohibition, began to question whether the cure was worse than the disease. Journalists investigated the denaturing program and published exposés that shocked readers. The most famous was a series in the New York World that traced the path of denatured alcohol from government-bonded warehouses to bootlegger redistilleries to speakeasy bars to hospital morgues. The reporters found evidence that some government officials were complicit in the diversion, that inspectors were bribed to look the other way, that the entire enforcement apparatus was riddled with corruption. Yet the poisoning continued. Year after year, administration after administration, through the Harding presidency and the Coolidge presidency and into the Hoover presidency, the government continued to require deadly denaturants, and people continued to die. The Christmas and New Year's holidays were particularly deadly, because that was when demand peaked and bootleggers would rush any product to market, no matter how toxic. Hospitals learned to prepare for the surge, stocking extra antidotes, training staff in the symptoms and treatment of methanol poisoning. In some cities, public health officials tried to warn people, publishing lists of symptoms, advising anyone who felt sick after drinking to seek immediate medical attention. But the warnings were hampered by prohibition itself. People were reluctant to admit they'd been drinking illegal alcohol, reluctant to go to a hospital where they might be arrested or exposed. Many victims died at home, their families too frightened or too ashamed to call for help until it was too late. The death toll was not evenly distributed. Poor neighborhoods, immigrant communities, black neighborhoods in segregated cities, these bore the brunt of the poisoning. Wealthy drinkers had access to imported liquor, to better quality bootleg, to doctors who would treat them discreetly. Poor drinkers had access to whatever rotgut was cheapest, sold from basement speakeasies where a shot cost a nickel, and questions were not asked. The class dimension of prohibition was always present, but nowhere more visible than in the mortality statistics. Rich people went blind occasionally. Poor people went blind by the hundreds. The poisoning was not limited to methanol. The other denaturants also caused harm, though usually less dramatically. Benzene caused cancer. Mercury salts caused kidney failure. The various petroleum distillates caused chemical pneumonia, if aspirated during vomiting. Some of the symptoms were immediate. Others took years to manifest. Doctors in the 1930s and 1940s would see patients with mysterious neurological symptoms, with liver damage, with cancers, and trace the origin back to poisoned alcohol consumed during prohibition years before. There were also the secondary effects, the broader social harms. People learned not to trust what they drank, not to trust the government that was supposed to protect them, not to trust the medical establishment that sometimes turned patients over to law enforcement. The erosion of trust, once begun, was hard to reverse. Even after prohibition ended, even after legal alcohol returned, the suspicion remained. And for good reason, because the poisoning didn't stop with prohibition's repeal. The repeal of prohibition in 1933 ended the government's program of adding deadly denaturants to industrial alcohol, but it didn't end the problem of methanol poisoning. The economic incentives remained. Methanol was still cheaper than ethanol, and there were still criminals willing to make fake liquor, still desperate people willing to buy the cheapest alcohol available, still gaps in enforcement that made fraud profitable. In the depths of the Great Depression, with millions unemployed and desperate, poisoning incidents continued. Moonshiners in the rural South, using improvised stills, sometimes produced alcohol contaminated with methanol from improper distillation technique. The methanol, concentrated in the first and last portions of a distillation run, was supposed to be discarded. But discarding meant wasting product, and in desperate economic times, waste was unthinkable. So it was mixed in, diluting the good alcohol, stretching the batch, increasing profits. And people died, or went blind, in isolated incidents that rarely made national news. The Second World War brought new problems. Rationing limited legal alcohol production, and a black market sprang up to meet demand. Military bases, naval ports, boom towns around defense plants, all had thriving illegal alcohol trades. Some of it was diverted legal product. Some was illegally produced. Quality control was minimal. The military services issued warnings to personnel, threats of court-martial for anyone caught with bootleg, but the trade continued. After the war, investigations revealed multiple poisoning incidents among military personnel, hushed up to avoid scandal. The victims quietly discharged with medical disability ratings that mentioned complications from alcohol consumption, without specifying that the alcohol had been methanol. But the worst methanol disasters of the 20th century occurred not in America but abroad, in countries where poverty was more extreme, where regulation was weaker, where the human cost of corners cut in pursuit of profit was even more devastating. India, with its complex relationship to alcohol shaped by religious traditions, colonial legacy, and post-independence politics, became the site of repeated mass poisonings. Some states banned alcohol entirely, creating black markets. Other states permitted it, but taxed it so heavily that illegal alcohol was far cheaper. The economics were brutal and simple. A laborer earning a few rupees a day could not afford legal liquor, but he could afford hooch made in a backyard still from fermented sugar, grain, or even industrial waste. The poisonings followed a pattern. A batch of illicit alcohol would appear in a neighborhood or village, sold cheaply, consumed eagerly. Within hours, people would begin falling sick. The hospitals would fill with victims suffering the telltale symptoms: vomiting, abdominal pain, respiratory distress, vision loss. The death toll would mount. The police would investigate, usually after the damage was done. Sometimes they caught the producers, sometimes the producers fled. The scale of these disasters was shocking. In 1981, an outbreak in Karnataka killed over 300 people. In 2009, in Gujarat, more than 100 died. These were not isolated incidents, but recurring catastrophes, predictable and preventable, yet they continued. The cause was usually methanol, sometimes deliberately added to increase intoxication at lower cost, sometimes the result of contaminated industrial alcohol diverted from legitimate uses. India produces enormous quantities of industrial methanol for export and domestic use in manufacturing. It's supposed to be tightly controlled, with dye added to make it easily identifiable, with distribution tracked from factory to end user. But corruption makes enforcement difficult. A bribed official, a falsified shipping document, and industrial methanol flows into the illicit alcohol market. The social dynamics make prevention even harder. The victims are usually poor, often from marginalized castes or religious minorities, people with little political power and less access to justice. The producers are sometimes desperate people themselves, making a living the only way they can in an economy that offers few options. The consumers know the risks, or some of them do, but poverty and addiction create a kind of terrible calculus. The chance of death tomorrow weighed against the certainty of misery today, and the alcohol wins. Public health officials in India have studied these outbreaks exhaustively, published papers, made recommendations. Legalize alcohol everywhere, and regulate it properly, they say. Tax it less so legal alcohol can compete with illegal. Crack down on corruption in the industrial alcohol supply chain. Provide addiction treatment services. Educate the public about the dangers of unbranded alcohol. The recommendations are sensible, evidence-based and largely ignored, because they conflict with political and economic interests. Religious conservatives want alcohol banned entirely. State governments depend on alcohol taxes for revenue. The industrial alcohol industry resists tighter controls as expensive and burdensome. And so the poisonings continue, erupting periodically, killing dozens or hundreds, fading from the news, erupting again. Iran, where alcohol is banned entirely under Islamic law, has seen similar disasters. Prohibition creates a complete black market. Everything is illegal, nothing is regulated, quality control is non-existent. During the COVID-19 pandemic, a rumor spread on social media that drinking alcohol could prevent or cure coronavirus infection. There was no scientific basis for this claim, but desperate people believed it. Demand for alcohol surged. The black market responded. Producers, rushing to meet demand, cut corners. Much of the alcohol sold was methanol, sometimes nearly pure, labeled and sold as drinkable spirits. The result was catastrophic. Hospitals across Iran were overwhelmed with methanol poisoning cases. Victims showed up blind, seizing, dying. The official death toll exceeded 700, but the real number is believed to be much higher, because many people died at home. afraid to seek medical attention because possessing alcohol is a criminal offense. Even as they were dying from poisoned alcohol, victims and their families feared arrest. This fear prevented early treatment, which worsened outcomes. It also prevented accurate counting of cases, which meant the full scope of the disaster remained hidden. The Iranian government's response was to crack down on the black market, to arrest producers and sellers, to issue warnings through state media, but they could not address the fundamental problem. Prohibition creates black markets, and black markets operate without safety standards. As long as alcohol is completely illegal, as long as possession can result in flogging or imprisonment, people will not seek help when they're poisoned, will not report contaminated alcohol, will not cooperate with public health investigations. The ban remains, for religious and political reasons that override public health considerations, and the poisonings continue at a lower but steady rate. Even wealthy countries with strong regulatory systems are not immune. In 2012, the Czech Republic experienced a methanol poisoning outbreak that killed 38 people and caused blindness in many others. The source was bootleg rum and vodka that had been mixed with industrial methanol and sold through legitimate shops, not just back-alley dealers. The sophistication of the operation was striking. The bottles looked professional, the labels were convincing, the prices were competitive with legal alcohol. Only chemical analysis could reveal that the contents were deadly. The Czech government responded by temporarily banning all spirits sales, legal and illegal, until the contaminated bottles could be traced and removed from circulation. It was an extraordinary measure, and it worked. The outbreak was contained, but it revealed how vulnerable even well-regulated alcohol markets are to sophisticated criminals, willing to kill their customers for profit. The methanol had been purchased legally, diverted from its intended industrial use, and mixed into fake alcohol in a professional-looking bottling operation. If it could happen in the Czech Republic, with its strong traditions of brewing and distilling, its competent regulatory authorities, its educated population, it could happen anywhere. The lesson, if there is one, is that the problem of illicit alcohol is not primarily a problem of law enforcement, or even of chemistry. It's a problem of economics and human nature. As long as there is demand for alcohol, and as long as legal alcohol is expensive or unavailable, there will be people willing to make and sell illegal alcohol. And as long as illegal alcohol is profitable, some producers will cut costs by any means necessary, including using poisons that kill. This dynamic plays out differently in different contexts, but the fundamental pattern is always the same. In India, high taxes on legal alcohol create a price gap that illegal alcohol fills. In Iran, total prohibition creates a complete black market. In the Czech Republic, the profit margin on premium spirits makes counterfeiting attractive. In rural America during the Depression, economic desperation drove people to make and sell anything that would bring in cash. The specific circumstances vary, but the underlying logic is constant. Wherever regulation creates artificial scarcity or inflated prices, black markets emerge. And wherever black markets operate, product safety becomes someone else's problem. The modern era has brought new sophistication to both production and enforcement, but it has not solved the fundamental problem. Today's illicit alcohol producers use the same methanol that killed people during Prohibition, but they also have access to a bewildering array of industrial chemicals that can be mixed into alcohol to increase volume, mimic expensive brands, or create specific effects. The internet has made it easier to obtain these chemicals, to learn techniques for counterfeiting branded bottles, to connect buyers and sellers across borders. At the same time, enforcement has become more sophisticated. Customs officials use spectroscopy to analyze suspicious shipments. Tax authorities track legitimate alcohol production from distillery to retail. Police forces have specialized units that focus on alcohol fraud. But enforcement is always playing catch-up, always reacting to the latest scheme, always one step behind the criminals who have every incentive to stay ahead. The scale of the modern counterfeit alcohol trade is difficult to estimate precisely, but industry groups suggest it's enormous. In China, fake versions of premium Western whiskies and cognacs are so common that legitimate importers have given up trying to eliminate them, and focus instead on making their bottles harder to counterfeit. In Russia, illegal and semi-legal alcohol may account for a third or more of total consumption, a hangover from the Soviet era when state vodka was often in short supply and home distillation was a survival skill. In East Africa, cheap spirits made from industrial ethanol and sold in small plastic sachets have become a public health crisis, causing addiction, poisoning, and social breakdown in urban slums. What makes the problem intractable is that it operates at every level of society. At the top, organized criminal networks import industrial alcohol, set up sophisticated bottling operations, distribute through corrupt officials and compromised distribution networks. In the middle, small-time operators buy bulk alcohol and rebottle it in their garages, selling to neighborhood shops and bars. At the bottom, desperate individuals make crude alcohol in home stills, selling to even more desperate consumers. Each level of the market has its own economics, its own risks, its own victims. The health consequences extend far beyond acute methanol poisoning, though that remains the most dramatic. Chronic consumption of poorly made alcohol, even when it doesn't contain methanol, causes a range of problems. The impurities from improper distillation, the chemical residues from inadequate equipment, the bacterial contamination from unsanitary production, all contribute to liver disease, neurological damage, increased cancer risk. These chronic effects are harder to track than mass poisonings, harder to attribute to specific products, but they accumulate across populations, shortening lives, reducing quality of life, straining healthcare systems. There's also the social cost, harder to quantify but no less real. Communities where illicit alcohol is prevalent tend to suffer higher rates of domestic violence, child neglect, workplace accidents, crime. The causality runs in both directions. Social breakdown drives alcohol abuse and alcohol abuse drives social breakdown. Breaking this cycle is extraordinarily difficult, especially in places where formal economic opportunities are limited, where social services are inadequate, where alcohol offers one of the few affordable escapes from grinding poverty. Some countries have tried novel approaches. South Africa, facing an epidemic of illicit alcohol consumption in townships and informal settlements, has experimented with regulated micro-distilleries, allowing small producers to operate legally under supervision, providing a path for informal producers to go legitimate. The idea is to bring production into the light, where it can be monitored and taxed, rather than driving it underground where it operates without any oversight. The results have been mixed. Some producers embrace legalization, others stay in the shadows, either because they can't meet regulatory standards, or because they prefer operating outside the system. Nordic countries, with their historical state monopolies on alcohol sales, have maintained relatively tight control over the market, but even they face challenges from cross-border shopping and internet sales. The European Union's single market makes it legal to bring unlimited alcohol across borders for personal use, which creates opportunities for semi-legal arbitrage. People living near borders cross into lower tax jurisdictions to buy alcohol in bulk, then resell it informally back home. Is this illicit alcohol? It occupies a grey zone between legal personal import and illegal commercial sale. The internet has created new grey zones. Online marketplaces connect buyers and sellers across jurisdictions, making enforcement difficult. A bottle of premium cognac bought from an overseas website might be genuine, or it might be a sophisticated counterfeit, and the buyer has no way to know until it arrives, if then. Platforms hosting these sales have little incentive to police them rigorously, especially when they take a percentage of every transaction. Law enforcement agencies struggle to keep up, lacking the resources and often the legal authority to pursue cases that cross multiple jurisdictions. The COVID-19 pandemic created a surge in counterfeit hand sanitizer that revealed just how porous the alcohol supply chain had become. As demand for sanitizer exploded and legal production couldn't keep up, countless fly-by-night operations began producing sanitizer from whatever alcohol they could source. Some used proper ethanol, others used methanol, which is ineffective as a sanitizer and dangerous if absorbed through skin or inhaled. Still others used isopropyl alcohol, which works but causes different health issues than ethanol. Testing by regulators in the United States, Europe and Asia found that a significant percentage of hand sanitizers on the market during the pandemic contained methanol, or were otherwise contaminated. Some were imported from countries with weak regulatory oversight, others were made domestically by producers who took advantage of emergency relaxations in rules to enter the market. The FDA issued repeated warnings, published lists of dangerous products, but the problem persisted because the supply chain had been thoroughly infiltrated by bad actors, and there was no quick way to clean it out. The hand sanitizer crisis highlighted a broader truth. The industrial alcohol supply chain is vulnerable at every point. Methanol is produced in vast quantities, shipped in tanker trucks and rail cars, stored in warehouses, distributed to thousands of industrial users. Every transfer point is an opportunity for diversion. Every transaction is an opportunity for fraud. A single corrupted official, a single falsified document, and thousands of gallons of methanol flow into channels where it was never meant to go. The economics are overwhelming. Industrial methanol costs perhaps a tenth as much as ethanol. The profit margin on substituting methanol for ethanol is so large that it creates irresistible temptation for anyone with access to the supply chain and a flexible conscience. The risk of getting caught is relatively low. The penalties, even when caught, often modest. The profits enormous. It's a classic case of incentives misaligned with public safety. Some countries have tried to address this by denaturing industrial methanol with distinctive dyes and odorants, making it obvious to consumers that what they're drinking isn't ethanol. But dyes can be filtered out with activated charcoal, odorants can be masked with strong flavors, and the most ruthless producers simply don't care. They're not selling to informed consumers making careful choices. They're selling to poor people, to addicts, to desperate individuals who will drink whatever is cheapest or whatever is available. Warning labels and distinctive coloring mean nothing to people who have no other options. The human stories behind the statistics are heartbreaking. A father who buys what he thinks is cheap whiskey to celebrate his daughter's wedding and wakes up blind, never to see her face again. A group of friends sharing a bottle on a hot afternoon, and by evening 3 of them are dead and 2 are in comas. A woman who takes a single shot at a party and spends the rest of her life on dialysis because her kidneys were destroyed by the chemicals in the bootleg gin. These are not cautionary tales meant to scare people away from all alcohol. These are tragedies that could be prevented if the alcohol market were properly regulated, if enforcement were adequate, if the economic incentives were different, but changing those incentives is politically difficult almost everywhere. In countries where alcohol is taxed heavily to generate government revenue, lowering taxes would mean losing that revenue, which would have to be made up elsewhere. In countries where alcohol is banned for religious reasons, legalization is politically impossible, regardless of public health arguments. In countries with powerful criminal organizations, cracking down on illicit alcohol means confronting groups that have the resources to fight back, to bribe officials, to intimidate witnesses, to simply move their operations to another jurisdiction. There's also the challenge of changing cultural attitudes. In many places, drinking illicit alcohol is not seen as particularly risky, or at least not risky enough to justify the higher cost of legal alcohol. People have been drinking moonshine, or hooch, or whatever the local term is, for generations. Their parents drank it, their grandparents drank it. Most of the time, nothing bad happens. The poisonings, when they occur, are seen as bad luck, as the result of one bad producer, not as evidence of systemic risk. This normalization of risk makes prevention campaigns difficult. How do you convince someone that they're playing Russian roulette when they've pulled the trigger 100 times and the gun hasn't fired? The answer, public health experts argue, is not to focus on individual behavior change, which is extremely difficult, but on systems change. Make legal alcohol affordable, regulate production rigorously. Enforce penalties for adulteration strictly enough to change the risk-reward calculation for would-be poisoners. Provide treatment for addiction so people aren't driven to consume the cheapest available alcohol, regardless of risk. Address the poverty and social breakdown that make dangerous alcohol consumption attractive in the first place. These are sensible recommendations, supported by evidence from the few places that have implemented them successfully. But they require sustained political will, significant resources, and a willingness to treat alcohol policy as a public health issue, rather than a moral or criminal justice issue. In practice, most countries do some of these things some of the time, but few do all of them consistently. The result is a global patchwork of alcohol regulation, some parts effective, many parts not, all of it under constant pressure from economic forces that push toward cheaper production and weaker oversight. The other major category of illicit alcohol, beyond the methanol poisonings and industrial contamination, is the vast world of untaxed but otherwise legitimate alcohol. This is the moonshine tradition, the artisanal distilling that happens outside formal regulation, sometimes producing excellent product, sometimes producing drinkable product, occasionally producing dangerous product, but always producing untaxed product. From the perspective of governments, this is a fiscal problem, they're losing tax revenue. From the perspective of consumers, it's often a cultural tradition, a way to save money or both. The American moonshine tradition is probably the best known globally, romanticized in popular culture, associated with rural self-reliance and defiance of authority. The historical reality is more complex. Moonshining in Appalachia and the rural South emerged in the 19th century as a way for small farmers to convert their corn crop into something more valuable and more portable. A bushel of corn might sell for a few cents and was bulky to transport. Distill that corn into whiskey, and you had a product worth dollars that could fit in a few jugs. For isolated farmers with poor access to markets, distilling was an economic necessity. The federal government, needing revenue after the Civil War, imposed taxes on distilled spirits. Suddenly, what had been a traditional economic activity became illegal, unless you paid the tax and submitted to inspection. Many farmers refused, on principle, or because they couldn't afford the license fee. The result was a century-long cat-and-mouse game between moonshiners and revenue agents, celebrated in song and story, often violent, always economically driven. The quality of moonshine varied enormously. Some shiners took pride in their work, using good ingredients, proper techniques, aging the spirits in charred oak barrels just like commercial distillers. Their product was indistinguishable from legal whiskey, except for the lack of tax stamps. Other shiners, especially those producing large volumes for urban markets, cut every corner. They used poor quality grain, contaminated water, inadequately cleaned equipment. They didn't discard the heads and tails of the distillation run, which contained methanol and other impurities. The resulting product was harsh, dangerous, marketed to people who cared only about alcohol content and price. The most infamous aspect of commercial moonshining was the use of car radiators as condensers in the distilling apparatus. Radiators were cheap, widely available, and had the necessary tubes and cooling capacity to condense alcohol vapor back into liquid. The problem was that radiators contained lead solder, and as the hot alcohol vapor passed through, it would leach lead into the final product. Lead poisoning from moonshine became common enough that doctors in the rural South learned to recognize the symptoms: abdominal pain, constipation, weakness, cognitive impairment, the characteristic blue line on the gums. Unlike methanol poisoning, which kills quickly or causes blindness immediately, lead poisoning is insidious. It accumulates over time, damaging the nervous system, the kidneys, the blood. Chronic moonshine drinkers would develop what was called Jake leg, or lead palsy, a distinctive gait caused by nerve damage in the legs. Some lost the ability to walk entirely, others suffered cognitive decline, personality changes, violent outbursts that were actually symptoms of brain damage. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that many victims had no idea they were being poisoned. They thought their declining health was just the natural result of aging or hard living, not realizing that every drink was adding to their body burden of lead. By the 1960s and 1970s, as health awareness increased and alternatives to lead solder became available, responsible moonshiners switched to all copper or stainless steel stills. But the damage had been done to generations of drinkers, and the reputation of moonshine as inherently dangerous was established. Even today, despite the fact that many craft distillers produce excellent, unaged corn whiskey using traditional methods, the term moonshine carries connotations of danger and poor quality that are hard to shake. The economics of moonshining changed dramatically with the end of Prohibition and the establishment of modern alcohol taxation systems. During Prohibition, moonshiners were competing with other illegal producers or with expensive smuggled liquor. After repeal, they were competing with legal distilleries that had economies of scale, professional equipment, established distribution networks. The only advantage moonshiners had was the absence of taxes, which in the United States can account for 50% or more of the retail price of spirits. This tax advantage was enough to keep the trade alive, especially in rural areas where cultural acceptance of moonshining remained high and where the economic alternatives were limited. But the nature of the trade shifted. Instead of small farmer distillers making whiskey for their own use and selling the surplus to neighbors, moonshining became increasingly professionalized and commercialized. Large-scale operations, some producing thousands of gallons per month, supplied urban markets through organized distribution networks. These were criminal enterprises in every sense, evading not just alcohol taxes, but also income taxes, operating without business licenses, sometimes with connections to other forms of organized crime. Law enforcement adapted. The Treasury Department's Alcohol Tax Unit, later reorganized into the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, developed specialized techniques for finding and raiding stills. They used aerial surveillance to spot the telltale signs: cleared areas in remote locations, unusual amounts of firewood, smoke from fires used to heat the stills, traffic patterns inconsistent with normal rural activity. They tracked sugar purchases, because large-scale moonshining requires enormous amounts of sugar to ferment. They cultivated informants within moonshining communities, using the threat of prosecution to flip small operators who would inform on larger ones. The raids themselves were often dangerous. Moonshiners, protecting valuable equipment and product that represented significant investment, sometimes defended their stills with firearms. Revenue agents were shot at, booby traps were set around still sites, and the rural terrain favored defenders who knew every path and hiding place. The violence was never as extreme as Prohibition-era gang warfare in cities, but it was persistent, and it shaped the culture of both moonshiners and the agents who pursued them. By the 1980s, large-scale moonshining in the United States was in decline, not primarily because of enforcement, but because economic conditions changed. Rural poverty remained, but other economic opportunities emerged. Welfare programs, social security, disability payments, all provided alternative income sources. The cultural isolation that had sustained moonshining communities was broken down by television, by improved roads, by the gradual integration of rural areas into the broader economy. Young people left for cities. The knowledge of distilling, once passed down through families, was no longer being transmitted. What remained was a small-scale craft tradition and a romanticized cultural memory. Some moonshiners went legitimate, obtaining licenses and producing legal whiskey using traditional methods. Others continued to operate illegally, but on a much smaller scale, making whiskey for personal consumption and for a small circle of customers who valued the tradition and the personal connection more than they feared legal consequences. The economic incentive for large-scale illegal distilling had largely disappeared, not because taxes had decreased, but because the risks had increased, and because legal alcohol was now affordable enough that the price advantage of untaxed spirits wasn't worth the risk for most consumers. But in other parts of the world, the moonshining tradition remains vibrant and economically important. In Eastern Europe, home distilling of fruit brandies is so common that it's barely considered illegal, even though technically it violates tax laws. In Poland, in Romania, in the former Soviet states, countless households have small stills producing plum brandy, apple brandy, pear brandy, whatever fruit is locally abundant. The quality ranges from excellent to barely drinkable, but it's generally safe because the tradition is old, the techniques are established, and people know to discard the heads and tails that contain methanol. The social role of this home distilling is important. It's a marker of hospitality, a form of cultural continuity, a practical use for surplus fruit that might otherwise go to waste. When you visit someone's home, they offer you their homemade brandy, and refusing would be insulting. The alcohol content is high, the flavor is intense, and the social obligation is clear: you drink, you compliment, you reciprocate when they visit you. The government officially disapproves, but generally turns a blind eye, because enforcement would be impossible and politically unpopular. The situation is similar in many rural areas of Asia. In China, baijiu is traditionally made in small family distilleries, some legal and licensed, many operating in a grey zone between formal and informal economy. In Korea, home distilling of soju was common until relatively recently, and still persists in rural areas. In Southeast Asia, rice wine and distilled spirits are produced in villages using methods unchanged for centuries, sold in local markets, consumed at festivals and celebrations, rarely if ever taxed or regulated. From a public health perspective, this kind of small-scale traditional distilling is relatively low risk. The producers have reputational incentives to make safe product because they're selling to neighbors and family, not to anonymous urban markets. The techniques have been refined over generations to minimize dangerous impurities. The scale is small enough that any poisoning incident would have immediate local consequences, creating strong incentives for care and quality. The problems arise when traditional small-scale production is industrialized and commercialized while remaining illegal and unregulated. This is what happened in India, where the tradition of home-brewed alcohol was scaled up to meet urban demand, but without the regulatory oversight that would ensure safety. The producers lost the reputational constraints of producing for people they knew, and gained the profit incentive to cut corners when producing for anonymous markets. The result was the mass poisonings we discussed earlier, tragedies that traditional moonshining, for all its illegality, rarely produces. This distinction between traditional artisanal production and industrial-scale illicit production is crucial for understanding alcohol policy. Trying to eliminate all informal alcohol production is probably impossible and might not even be desirable given the cultural importance and generally low risk of traditional practices. But preventing the industrialization and commercialization of illicit production, preventing the emergence of large-scale operations that treat safety as an externality and consumers as anonymous marks, this is both achievable and essential for public health. Hinus 50 bin karkata, oldu devam, I 20 bin karkata, yazarak. The scale of this environmental damage is difficult to measure precisely because the operations are hidden and the producers have no incentive to document their impact. But in regions where illicit distilling is common, the effects are visible. Streams run cloudy with organic waste, their oxygen depleted, their fish populations crashed. Forest floors are littered with discarded equipment, plastic containers that once held chemicals, the remains of makeshift stills abandoned when law enforcement got too close. The acidic waste from fermentation kills vegetation, and the fuel used to heat the stills, often scrap wood or coal burned inefficiently, creates localized air pollution. In some parts of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, environmental researchers have documented dead zones around abandoned still sites, areas where nothing grows because the soil has been so thoroughly contaminated. The remediation of these sites, when it happens at all, is expensive and difficult. Often it doesn't happen. The sites simply remain as toxic scars on the landscape, gradually leaching their poisons into groundwater, spreading contamination downstream. The carbon footprint of illicit alcohol production is also significant, though rarely accounted for in environmental assessments. Inefficient stills, poor insulation, the use of whatever fuel is cheapest rather than what's most efficient, all contribute to higher emissions per litre of alcohol produced compared to modern distilleries with their optimized processes and environmental controls. Multiply this by millions of gallons produced annually in improvised facilities around the world, and the total impact is substantial. But perhaps the most perverse environmental impact comes from government enforcement efforts. When authorities discover an illegal still, they typically destroy it on site. This means whatever chemicals were being used, whatever alcohol was in the system, whatever waste had accumulated, all gets dumped or burned right there. The destruction of the still becomes an acute pollution event, worse in some cases than the chronic pollution from ongoing operation. Fuel tanks are punctured and left to leak, chemical containers are smashed open. Mash is dumped in bulk. The immediate goal is to eliminate the still's productive capacity, but the environmental consequences are an afterthought at best. Some jurisdictions have tried to develop more environmentally responsible enforcement protocols, requiring that hazardous materials be removed before destruction, that sites be remediated after raids. But these protocols are expensive and time-consuming, and in practice they're often ignored in favor of quick destruction that eliminates the evidence and prevents the operators from returning. The environmental cost is externalized, left for someone else to deal with later, if anyone deals with it at all. This environmental dimension of illicit alcohol ties into broader questions about informal economic activity and sustainability. The informal economy, by definition, operates outside regulatory frameworks designed to protect public health, worker safety, environmental quality, and consumer interests. When we talk about bringing informal activity into the formal economy, we're talking not just about taxation and licensing, but about imposing standards that internalize costs that informal operators currently externalize. The challenge is doing this without destroying livelihoods or driving activity further underground. A farmer who's been making brandy from surplus fruit for decades might not be able to afford the equipment upgrades and environmental controls required for formal licensing. If the choice is between going out of business and continuing illegally, many will choose to continue illegally. The optimal policy is not to demand immediate compliance with standards designed for industrial-scale operations, but to create pathways for gradual formalization with scaled requirements based on production volume. Some countries have experimented with tiered licensing systems that recognize this reality. A micro-producer making a few hundred liters per year faces minimal requirements: basic safety standards, record keeping, payment of modest license fees. A medium-scale producer making thousands of liters faces higher standards, environmental impact assessments, regular inspections, proper waste disposal. Large industrial-scale producers face the full regulatory burden. This approach allows traditional small-scale production to continue legally while ensuring that operations with significant public health or environmental impact are properly regulated. The effectiveness of such systems depends on administrative capacity and political will. Creating a tiered system is one thing, implementing it fairly and consistently is another. In countries with limited bureaucratic capacity or significant corruption, even well-designed systems can fail if inspectors are too few, too poorly trained, or too easily bribed. The regulations become barriers that protect established operators from competition rather than protecting public interests from harm. There's also the question of how changing social attitudes toward alcohol fit into this picture. The temperance movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries, while they ultimately failed to eliminate alcohol consumption, did succeed in changing how society thinks about drinking. The idea that alcohol is a dangerous substance requiring regulation rather than simply another commodity became broadly accepted. The idea that government has a legitimate interest in controlling alcohol availability and reducing alcohol harm became uncontroversial in most places. But these attitudes are not static. In recent years there's been something of a craft alcohol renaissance, a renewed interest in traditional production methods, artisanal techniques, local ingredients. This movement has been driven partly by changing consumer preferences, a desire for authenticity and quality over mass-produced uniformity, and partly by economic factors, the realization that craft production can command premium prices and create jobs in rural areas where economic opportunities are limited. This renaissance has complicated alcohol policy in interesting ways. On one hand, it's created political pressure to relax regulations that were designed for large industrial producers and make little sense for small craft operations. The movement to legalize home distilling in some jurisdictions, to create simplified licensing processes for micro-distilleries, to allow direct sales from producers to consumers, all reflect the influence of the craft movement and its allies. On the other hand, the same movement has created new opportunities for fraud and adulteration. The term craft has value in the marketplace, and unscrupulous producers will claim craft credentials for industrial products. A bottle labeled as small batch artisanal whiskey might actually contain industrial alcohol with flavoring added. The consumer who pays premium price for supposed craft quality is being defrauded, but the fraud is difficult to detect and prosecute, because the definitions of terms like craft and artisanal are vague and contested. This is not a new problem. The history of alcohol is full of producers making false claims about their products' origins, age, methods of production. But the craft movement has created new vulnerabilities because consumers are willing to pay much more for craft products, increasing the incentive to fake them, and because the narrative around craft production emphasizes trust and personal relationships rather than objective verification, making consumers more vulnerable to deception. Regulatory responses have been mixed. Some jurisdictions have tried to define terms like craft distillery legally, setting production volume limits or requiring certain percentages of local ingredients. Others have relied on industry self-regulation through associations that establish standards and police their members. Still others have taken a hands-off approach, treating craft claims as marketing rather than factual assertions subject to verification. Each approach has advantages and disadvantages. Legal definitions provide clarity but can be rigid and slow to adapt to changing market conditions. Self-regulation is flexible, but only works when industry associations have real power over their members and incentives to maintain standards. Hands-off approaches preserve freedom, but leave consumers vulnerable to deception and undermine trust in the market. What's clear is that as the craft movement grows, as more producers enter the market, making explicit or implicit claims about quality and authenticity, the potential for fraud grows with it. The same economic logic that drives methanol poisoning in the developing world drives craft fraud in wealthy markets. The profit from deception exceeds the risk of detection multiplied by the penalty if caught. Changing this calculus requires either better detection, which is expensive, or harsher penalties, which are politically difficult, or some combination of both. Meanwhile, the global pandemic brought a new dimension to illicit alcohol production that revealed just how quickly the market can adapt to changing circumstances. As countries locked down and legal alcohol sales were restricted, either because bars and restaurants closed, or because some governments prohibited alcohol sales entirely as a public health measure, illicit production surged. The demand for alcohol didn't disappear, it simply shifted to whatever supply was available. In South Africa, which imposed one of the world's longest alcohol sales bans during the pandemic, the illicit alcohol market expanded dramatically. Existing moonshiners ramped up production, new producers entered the market. Distribution networks adapted to the restrictions, using the same tactics that drug dealers use: home delivery, encrypted messaging apps, trusted intermediaries. When legal sales resumed, law enforcement officials estimated that the illicit market had grown by 50% or more during the ban, and that much of that growth would persist even after legal sales returned because producers and consumers had established relationships and systems that worked. The South African experience was replicated elsewhere, though rarely with such extended bans. In India, in parts of Southeast Asia, in some Middle Eastern countries, temporary alcohol restrictions during pandemic lockdowns created opportunities for illicit producers. The public health rationale for the bans, that reducing alcohol consumption would reduce domestic violence and free up hospital beds, may have been sound in theory. In practice, the bans simply shifted consumption to unregulated channels where the alcohol was more dangerous, and where domestic violence may have actually increased because people were drinking more concentrated, more adulterated alcohol in less supervised settings. The lesson, relearned once again, was that prohibition doesn't eliminate demand, it redirects it. And when demand is redirected to illegal suppliers, the results are predictable: lower quality, higher risk, greater harm. This is not an argument against all regulation or all restrictions, it's an argument for understanding how markets actually function, how people actually behave, and designing policies that account for predictable responses rather than hoping people will simply comply. Another pandemic-related development was the surge in counterfeit sanitizer that we mentioned earlier, but there's more to that story worth exploring. The hand sanitizer market, before COVID-19, was relatively small and dominated by established brands. The regulatory requirements were minimal because the product was low risk. The alcohol used was typically ethanol, properly denatured to prevent drinking but safe for skin contact. Quality control was generally good because the market was stable and reputational concerns mattered. When the pandemic hit and demand exploded, this stable market disintegrated overnight. Legitimate manufacturers couldn't scale up fast enough. Governments waived regulatory requirements to allow new producers to enter the market quickly, and criminal networks saw an opportunity. They began producing sanitizer, using whatever alcohol they could source, often methanol because it was cheaper and more available than ethanol, during a period when ethanol was in desperately short supply for both medical and beverage purposes. The methanol sanitizers didn't work as well, but consumers had no way to know that. They looked identical to legitimate sanitizer. They were sold through the same channels, online and in retail stores. The labeling was often sophisticated, mimicking real brands or creating plausible-sounding fake brands. Only laboratory testing could identify them, and testing capacity was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of product flooding the market. The health consequences were significant but different from drinking methanol. Skin absorption of methanol is slower than ingestion, so the poisoning was usually less acute. But children who ingested sanitizer, either accidentally or because they were too young to understand it wasn't food, suffered serious methanol poisoning. Healthcare workers who used contaminated sanitizer multiple times per shift over months absorbed cumulative doses that caused neurological symptoms. The full extent of harm may never be known because the symptoms can take months or years to manifest and are often misattributed to other causes. The regulatory response, once the problem was recognized, was to tighten requirements again, to mandate testing, to publish lists of banned products. But by then, millions of bottles of contaminated sanitizer had been distributed. Recall efforts were hampered by the fact that much of the product was sold through informal channels with no record of who bought what. People who had contaminated sanitizer in their homes or businesses had no reliable way to know whether their specific bottle was safe. This episode revealed critical vulnerabilities in the regulatory system for alcohol products. When regulatory requirements are waived during emergencies, when new producers can enter markets without adequate vetting, when supply chains are disrupted and demand is desperate, the opportunities for fraud and contamination multiply. The incentives for criminal activity increase because the potential profits are enormous and the probability of detection is low, and the human cost of this fraud is borne by the most vulnerable: healthcare workers, children, people with compromised immune systems, who relied on sanitizer to protect themselves during a pandemic. The broader lesson is that illicit alcohol, or alcohol-containing products, are not a problem that exists only at the margins of society, affecting only the poor or the criminal underworld. They can, under the right circumstances, penetrate mainstream markets, affecting millions of people who consider themselves careful consumers, who buy from reputable retailers, who have no reason to suspect the products they're using are dangerous. The membrane between the legitimate and illegitimate alcohol markets is thinner than most people realize, and when disrupted by crisis or rapid change, that membrane can rupture entirely. This brings us to perhaps the most important insight about illicit alcohol. It's not primarily a law enforcement problem, or even a public health problem, though it manifests as both. It's fundamentally an economic and social problem. People produce and consume illicit alcohol because economic incentives make production profitable, and because social conditions make consumption attractive or necessary. Addressing the problem effectively requires changing those underlying conditions, not just prosecuting criminals or warning consumers. What would those changes look like? Different answers apply in different contexts, but some principles are broadly applicable. First, legal alcohol must be affordable and accessible. If the price gap between legal and illegal alcohol is large, if legal alcohol is difficult to obtain because of restricted hours or limited distribution, people will turn to illegal suppliers. The optimal tax rate on alcohol is not zero. Taxation serves important public health and revenue purposes, but it's not so high that it creates irresistible incentives for black markets. Second, regulation must be proportionate and enforced consistently. Regulations that are too strict rave production underground. Regulations that are on the books but rarely enforced create uncertainty and reward those willing to break rules. The regulatory burden should match the scale and risk of production, minimal for small artisanal producers, comprehensive for large industrial operations. Third, treatment and social services must be available for people with alcohol problems. Much consumption of dangerous illicit alcohol is driven by addiction, by desperation, by the absence of alternatives. People will drink methanol-contaminated hooch, not because they don't know it's dangerous, but because they need alcohol, and it's what they can afford or access. Addressing that need requires addiction treatment, mental health services, economic opportunities that provide alternatives to the temporary relief alcohol offers. Fourth, enforcement must focus on the most harmful actors, the large-scale producers who knowingly sell poison, the organized networks that traffic in counterfeit products, the corrupt officials who enable them. Going after small-scale moonshiners or individual consumers is generally wasteful and counterproductive. The resources are better spent disrupting the commercial operations that cause the most harm. Fifth, public health messaging must be honest and credible. Campaigns that exaggerate dangers or rely on fear tactics are usually ineffective. People know others who have consumed illicit alcohol without obvious harm, and they discount warnings that seem disconnected from their lived experience. More effective are messages that provide specific, actionable information: how to identify potentially dangerous products, what symptoms indicate poisoning, where to seek help, how much risk different choices entail. These principles are not revolutionary. They're based on decades of research, on experiences in multiple countries, on the accumulated wisdom of public health professionals, economists, law enforcement officials, and community organizers. The fact that they're not widely implemented speaks to the difficulty of translating evidence into policy, especially when that policy requires sustained investment, political courage, and a willingness to challenge entrenched interests and moral certainties. The politics of alcohol policy are treacherous in almost every country. Alcohol occupies a unique space in human culture, simultaneously celebrated and condemned, woven into religious rituals and blamed for moral decay, central to social bonding and responsible for violence and family breakdown. Any policy change, no matter how well justified by evidence, will face opposition from multiple directions. Reduce alcohol taxes to undercut the black market, and public health advocates protest that you're encouraging consumption. Increase treatment funding and fiscal conservatives complain about rewarding bad behavior. Legalize home distilling, and the commercial industry lobbies against competition. Crack down on moonshiners and rural communities see persecution of traditional culture. The result in most places is policy paralysis or incremental changes that don't fundamentally alter the landscape. The political path of least resistance is to maintain the status quo, to enforce laws sporadically, to respond to crises when they become too visible to ignore, and then let attention fade until the next crisis. This is not a conspiracy or a failure of governance. It's the natural result of competing pressures, limited resources, and the fundamental difficulty of regulating a substance that is both culturally embedded and biologically addictive. But there are examples of successful reform. places where policy changes have measurably reduced the harms from illicit alcohol. Portugal's decriminalization of drug possession, while not specifically targeting alcohol, created a framework that reduced stigma and increased access to treatment, with spillover effects on alcohol policy. Nordic countries' gradual liberalization of their state monopolies, allowing more retail competition while maintaining high standards of safety and quality, has reduced black market activity without the public health crises that opponents predicted. New Zealand's legalization of small-scale home distilling eliminated the contradiction of widespread illegal activity that everyone knew about, but officially didn't exist. These reforms share certain characteristics. They were evidence-based, drawing on research about what actually works rather than what feels right morally. They were implemented gradually, allowing time for adjustment and for problems to be identified and corrected. They involved consultation with stakeholders, including producers, public health officials, law enforcement, and affected communities. They were accompanied by adequate funding for whatever new systems or services were required, and they were sustained through changes in government, not abandoned at the first sign of difficulty or political opposition. The contrast with failed reforms is instructive. Russia's attempt to reduce alcohol consumption through dramatic price increases and sales restrictions in the mid-2000s drove a surge in illicit production and consumption of industrial alcohol, leading to thousands of deaths. India's state-level prohibition experiments have repeatedly created black markets and poisoning epidemics without reducing overall consumption. The United States prohibition remains the classic example of policy so disconnected from social reality that it created more harm than the problem it was meant to solve. What distinguishes successful from failed reforms is not the moral clarity of the objective. Reducing alcohol harm is always a worthy goal, but the realism of the implementation. Successful reforms account for how people actually behave, not how reformers wish they would behave. They recognize that making something illegal doesn't make it disappear. They understand that market forces are powerful and persistent, and that policy must work with those forces or at least not create incentives that are overwhelmingly contrary to policy goals. This pragmatism is often mistaken for moral compromise, for abandoning principle in favor of expedience. But there's nothing principled about policies that sound tough but create worse outcomes. There's nothing morally superior about maintaining prohibition in the face of evidence that it's killing people. The true moral question is not whether alcohol is good or bad in some abstract sense. It's what policies will minimize harm to actual human beings living in actual societies with all their complexity and contradiction. The future of illicit alcohol policy will likely be shaped by several emerging trends. First, the continued globalization of production and distribution makes purely national responses increasingly inadequate. A counterfeit operation might source industrial alcohol in one country, bottle it in another, label it in a third, and distribute it in a dozen more. Effective enforcement requires international cooperation, information sharing, harmonized standards. The frameworks for this cooperation exist but remain underfunded and politically fragile. Second, technological change is altering both the risks and the opportunities. New analytical techniques make it easier to detect contaminants and verify authenticity, but they're expensive and require trained personnel. Blockchain and other tracking technologies could make supply chains more transparent, but only if adopted widely and honestly. The internet and encrypted communications make it easier for illegal producers to find customers and evade detection, but also create digital trails that sophisticated enforcement can follow. Third, climate change and environmental stress will likely increase the pressures that drive illicit alcohol production. As water becomes scarcer, as agricultural productivity declines in some regions, as economic displacement increases, the desperation that makes dangerous alcohol attractive will grow. At the same time, the environmental damage from illicit production will become harder to ignore, as ecosystems become more fragile and less able to absorb pollution. Fourth, the ongoing evolution of social attitudes toward intoxication and consciousness alteration will reshape the alcohol market. The growing acceptance of cannabis in many jurisdictions, the emergence of psychedelics in therapeutic contexts, the development of new designer drugs, all create alternatives to alcohol that might reduce demand, or might simply add new dimensions to the problem of regulating intoxicating substances. How alcohol policy adapts to this changing landscape remains uncertain. What seems clear is that illicit alcohol will remain a significant global issue for the foreseeable future. The fundamental drivers, the demand for intoxication, the profit motive, the limits of enforcement, the social conditions that make dangerous consumption attractive, none of these are going away. The question is not whether illicit alcohol can be eliminated, but whether its harms can be reduced to acceptable levels, whatever that might mean in different contexts. The human cost of current policies is measurable and enormous. Thousands die each year from methanol poisoning. Tens of thousands suffer blindness, organ damage, neurological injury. Millions consume alcohol of uncertain quality and safety, playing a lottery where the stakes are their health and the odds are unknown. Communities are damaged by the violence and corruption that accompany illegal alcohol markets. Environments are poisoned by unregulated production. Tax revenues that could fund public services are lost to black markets. Against this cost, we must weigh the costs of policy change. Some are financial. More enforcement, more inspectors, more treatment services, all require funding. Some are political opposition from interest groups, moral traditionalists, cynics who doubt government can do anything effectively. Some are cultural, the loss of traditions, the disruption of established patterns, the uncertainty that accompanies any significant change. But perhaps the deepest cost is admitting that previous policies have failed, that the hard lines and absolute prohibitions and moral certainties were wrong, or at least insufficient. This admission is psychologically difficult for individuals, and even more so for institutions and societies. It requires acknowledging that harm was done in the name of principle, that people died because of policies that sounded right but worked wrong. The temptation to double down, to insist that the policy was correct and only the implementation failed, is strong and often overwhelming. Yet the evidence is clear. The history of illicit alcohol is largely a history of policy failure, of interventions that created the problems they were meant to solve, of good intentions paving roads to catastrophic outcomes. From the United States government poisoning its own citizens during Prohibition, to India's repeated prohibition experiments that generated mass poisonings, to Iran's total ban that killed hundreds during the pandemic. The pattern is consistent. When policy is driven by moral absolutism rather than pragmatic realism, people die. This is not an argument for abandoning all regulation or all moral consideration. Alcohol is genuinely dangerous. It kills through acute poisoning, through chronic disease, through accidents and violence. Reducing alcohol harm is a legitimate and important policy goal, but the means matter as much as the ends. Policies that increase harm in the name of reducing it are worse than no policy at all. Policies that ignore human nature, economic reality, and social context are doomed to fail no matter how morally righteous they sound. The way forward requires humility, a recognition that this is a problem without perfect solutions, only trade-offs and compromises. It requires honesty about what policies can and cannot achieve, about the limits of enforcement and the persistence of demand. It requires investment in the less dramatic but more effective interventions, treatment services, economic development, education that respects people's intelligence and experience, rather than lecturing them about dangers they already know. Most of all, it requires a shift in how we think about the problem. Illicit alcohol is not primarily about bad people making bad choices. It's about ordinary people responding to circumstances, seeking relief from pain or boredom or desperation, trying to make a living in economies that offer few options, navigating systems that are corrupt or dysfunctional or simply absent. Understanding this doesn't excuse the poisoners or the profiteers, those who knowingly sell death for profit, but it does suggest that lasting solutions must address the conditions that create both suppliers and consumers, not just prosecute individuals. The complete history of illicit alcohol is still being written. New chapters are added every time someone goes blind from contaminated spirits, every time a mass poisoning makes the news, every time a government implements a new policy that either succeeds or fails. What we can learn from the history so far is that the simplest solutions, ban it, tax it heavily, arrest everyone involved, rarely work as intended. The problems are too deep, too complex, too interwoven with the fabric of society to yield to simple interventions. But we can also learn that harm reduction is possible, that thoughtful policy informed by evidence and implemented with adequate resources can reduce deaths, can reduce suffering, can redirect markets in safer directions. This is not as satisfying as the fantasy of complete elimination, of a world without illicit alcohol or perhaps without alcohol entirely, but it's realistic, achievable, and it saves lives. In the end, that's what matters. The man who drinks moonshine in rural Kentucky, the woman buying bootleg vodka in a Mumbai slum, the teenager consuming methanol-laced hand sanitizer because he's desperate for intoxication during a pandemic lockdown, the village elder in Romania offering homemade plum brandy to a guest, The criminal syndicate bottling industrial alcohol in fake premium whiskey bottles, the government official who takes a bribe to ignore an illegal distillery, the public health worker trying to prevent the next mass poisoning, all of these are part of the story. They're connected by the substance, by the market, by the policies that shape both. Understanding these connections, seeing the system as a whole rather than as isolated incidents of individual failure or criminality, this is the first step toward better policy. The second step is having the courage to implement that policy even when it conflicts with moral intuitions or political convenience. The third step is sustaining the policy long enough to work through the inevitable difficulties and setbacks until harm is genuinely reduced and new equilibria are established. This is possible. We know it's possible because we've seen it work, partially and imperfectly but genuinely in places that have tried. What's required is not some revolutionary new insight or technology, though both can help. What's required is the political will to prioritize evidence over ideology, to accept compromise over purity, to measure success by lives saved rather than by the satisfaction of taking a hard line. The history of illicit alcohol should make us humble about what policy can achieve but not nihilistic about whether anything can be done. People will continue to seek intoxication, and some will always be willing to profit by selling dangerous substances. But the scale of harm, the number of deaths, the extent of suffering, these are not fixed by nature. They're the result of human choices, institutional structures, economic systems, and what humans have created. Humans can change. As we close this chapter of history and move into whatever comes next, the question is not whether we'll finally solve the problem of illicit alcohol. The question is whether we'll learn from past failures, whether we'll be guided by evidence rather than certainty, whether we'll prioritize human welfare over moral posturing. The answer to that question will determine how many people go blind, how many die, how many communities are damaged in the years ahead. The choice, as always, is ours. The modern methanol crisis, a global epidemic in plain sight. Let us turn now to the present day, to the contemporary crisis that unfolds daily in hospitals from Tehran to Nairobi, from rural India to urban Indonesia. The methanol poisonings we discussed in historical context are not merely historical, they are happening right now, with a frequency and scale that would shock most people in wealthy countries who imagine that such primitive dangers belong to the past. The year is 2025, and somewhere in the world today, perhaps this very hour, someone is going blind from methanol poisoning. Someone else is dying, their organs failing, their family helpless and confused about what's happening. A third person is making the decision to sell industrial alcohol as drinking spirits, knowing or at least suspecting that it might kill, but needing the money more than they fear the consequences. A fourth person, a public health official perhaps, is looking at the latest poisoning statistics and feeling the familiar mixture of anger and despair that comes from watching a preventable tragedy unfold again and again. The statistics are difficult to compile comprehensively because so many poisonings go unreported or misdiagnosed, but what we know is sobering enough. The World Health Organization estimates that hundreds of thousands of people are affected by illicit alcohol globally each year, with tens of thousands of deaths. The actual numbers are almost certainly higher, perhaps much higher, because data collection is weakest precisely in the places where the problem is worst. Consider Iran, which we mentioned earlier in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic poisonings. That crisis, which killed at least 700 people, and probably many more, was exceptional in its scale and sudden onset, but it was not exceptional in its fundamental nature. Iran experiences regular methanol poisoning outbreaks, smaller than the pandemic surge, but deadly nonetheless. A 2020 study published in the Journal of Medical Toxicology found that Iran has one of the highest rates of methanol poisoning in the world, with several hundred cases per year, even in non-pandemic times. The pattern is consistent. Someone produces or imports industrial methanol, mixes it with water and perhaps some flavoring, bottles it as vodka or arid, the traditional Persian spirit, and sells it through informal networks. Consumers, having no way to distinguish safe from unsafe product, and having grown accustomed to buying alcohol on the black market, because all alcohol is illegal, purchase and consume it. Hours later the symptoms begin. Some victims recognize what's happening and seek treatment. Others don't, or can't, or are too afraid of legal consequences to go to a hospital. The lucky ones receive ethanol infusion in time and recover, possibly with permanent vision damage. The unlucky ones die. Iranian authorities periodically crack down, arresting producers, confiscating product, issuing warnings. But the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. Alcohol is completely banned under Islamic law, which means all alcohol is produced and sold illegally, which means there's no quality control, no accountability, no recourse for consumers who are harmed. The religious prohibition is non-negotiable in Iran's political system, and so the poisonings continue, predictable as clockwork, mourned briefly when they surge, ignored otherwise as the cost of maintaining ideological purity. India presents a different pattern, but the same underlying problem. Alcohol is legal in most states but heavily taxed, creating a large price differential between legal and illegal product. Many consumers, especially poor rural and urban workers, simply cannot afford legal alcohol at the taxed price. The market responds by providing cheap alternatives, and those alternatives are frequently adulterated or contaminated with methanol. The Indian pattern of mass poisonings has become grimly routine. Every few years, sometimes every few months, an outbreak occurs. The numbers vary: 20 dead here, 100 there, occasionally climbing into the hundreds. The locations vary: Gujarat, where alcohol is banned entirely; Tamil Nadu, where it's legal but heavily taxed; Uttar Pradesh, where enforcement is inconsistent; West Bengal, where poverty drives consumption of the cheapest available intoxicants. But the mechanism is always essentially the same. Someone, often a small-time operator working from home or a makeshift facility, obtains industrial methanol. This might be diverted from legitimate industrial supply through bribery or falsified paperwork. It might be smuggled across state lines from jurisdictions with weaker controls. It might be stolen from factories or warehouses. However it's obtained, it's cheap, far cheaper than ethanol, and to the untrained eye it looks identical. The producer mixes the methanol with water to reduce the concentration, adds caramel coloring to make it look like whiskey or rum, perhaps adds some cheap flavoring compounds, and bottles it. The bottles might be genuine empties collected from trash or purchased from scrap dealers, their labels intact, or they might be new bottles with counterfeit labels. Either way, the result looks convincing enough to fool consumers who are not expecting deception, who have been buying from the same seller for months or years without problem. The product is distributed through informal networks. It's sold in small shops, from pushcarts by individuals who go door to door in slums and working-class neighborhoods. The price is perhaps 1/3 or 1/4 of legal alcohol. For someone earning a few dollars a day, this price differential is not a luxury. It's the difference between being able to afford alcohol at all or not. And in communities where alcohol consumption is deeply embedded in social rituals, where men gather after work to drink and talk, where celebrations and festivals involve communal drinking, abstinence is not really an option without social cost. So people buy the cheap hooch, they drink it. Most of the time, nothing extraordinary happens. The alcohol is weak, the taste is harsh, the hangover is brutal, but these are acceptable costs for affordable intoxication. This reinforces the behavior: the cheap stuff is fine, just not as smooth as the expensive brands. Then, one day, a bad batch enters circulation. Maybe the producer was careless about the methanol concentration. Maybe the source was industrial methanol that was particularly pure and toxic. Maybe the producer knowingly used straight methanol because ethanol was temporarily unavailable, and customers were demanding product. Whatever the reason, this batch is deadly. Within hours, people start arriving at hospitals. The symptoms are consistent: severe headache, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, difficulty breathing, vision problems. The doctors, if they're experienced, recognize methanol poisoning immediately. They start treatment, sodium bicarbonate, to address the metabolic acidosis. Fomepizole, if it's available. It usually isn't in rural India. Ethanol infusion to compete with the methanol metabolism. Dialysis if the poisoning is severe, and if dialysis is available. Again, often it isn't. But treatment only works if it started early enough, and many victims don't arrive in time. They didn't recognize the symptoms, or they tried to tough it out, or they were too poor to afford a hospital visit for what seemed like a bad hangover, or they were too frightened of being arrested for illegal alcohol consumption to seek help. By the time they arrive, or are carried in by family members, the damage is done. The formic acid produced by methanol metabolism has destroyed their optic nerves, has acidified their blood, has damaged their kidneys and liver. Some will die, others will survive but remain permanently blind. Still others will suffer chronic health problems for the rest of their lives. The aftermath follows a predictable pattern. Local media covers the story. There's public outrage. Politicians promise action. Police arrest the suspected producer. and maybe some sellers. The alcohol is traced back to its source, which is usually some small operation that can be shut down easily enough. There are calls for stricter enforcement, better regulation, more severe penalties. These calls are sincere, but they fade quickly because the next news cycle brings new crises, new outrages, and because the fundamental conditions that created the poisoning remain unchanged. A detailed study published in The Lancet in 2023 analyzed mass methanol poisonings in India over a 20-year period. The researchers found over 300 separate incidents, killing more than 8,000 people and causing blindness in thousands more. They found that poisonings were most common in states with either complete prohibition or very high alcohol taxes. They found that victims were overwhelmingly poor, overwhelmingly male, because cultural norms make women's alcohol consumption less common and more stigmatized, and overwhelmingly from marginalized communities. They found that prosecution of perpetrators was rare, and that even when prosecutions occurred, the penalties were often modest because the producers were themselves poor and sympathetic defendants. The study's conclusion was stark: unless fundamental policy changes occur, unless alcohol is made legally affordable, or unless enforcement dramatically improves, the poisonings will continue. The researchers noted that they were not optimistic about either change happening soon. Alcohol taxes are a major revenue source for state governments that depend on them to fund services. Prohibition in some states has powerful religious and social movement backing that makes repeal politically difficult. And enforcement capacity is limited by corruption, lack of resources, and the sheer scale of the informal alcohol market. The situation in sub-Saharan Africa mirrors India's in many ways, but with additional complications. Many African countries have thriving informal alcohol sectors producing traditional fermented beverages, which are generally safe because fermentation alone doesn't produce methanol in dangerous quantities. But there's also a growing market for cheap spirits, and this is where the danger lies. In Kenya, a product called changaa, traditionally a distilled grain spirit, has become increasingly commercialized and dangerous. What was once small-scale home production for local consumption has become industrial-scale production for urban markets. The producers, seeking maximum profit, often add industrial alcohol to increase potency at minimal cost. The industrial alcohol is frequently methanol, or contains significant methanol contamination. A 2019 outbreak in Nairobi killed 47 people and hospitalized more than 200. Investigation revealed that the changaa implicated in the deaths contained methanol concentrations of 30 to 40%. At those levels, even a small drink, a single shot, could be lethal. The producers knew or should have known that their product was deadly, but the profit margins were too attractive to resist. They were selling for perhaps $3 per litre, making perhaps $2 profit, and producing thousands of litres per month. The arithmetic of desperation and greed worked out to dozens of deaths. What makes the African situation particularly tragic is that it's often occurring in countries with minimal healthcare infrastructure. When methanol poisonings occur in India or Iran, at least there are hospitals with dialysis machines, with doctors who know how to treat toxic alcohol poisoning. In rural Kenya, in Uganda, in Tanzania, victims might be hours away from any medical facility, and when they arrive, the facility might lack the equipment or medications needed for treatment. The mortality rate is correspondingly higher. The East African Community, a regional organization of several countries, has attempted to coordinate alcohol policy and enforcement. They've established regional standards, shared information about contaminated batches, conducted joint operations against large-scale producers. These efforts have had some success, but they're hampered by the same problems that plague national enforcement: limited resources, corruption, and the economic reality that millions of people depend on the informal alcohol sector for their livelihoods, either as producers, distributors, or sellers. In Southeast Asia, the pattern repeats with local variations. Indonesia experienced a series of mass poisonings in 2018 that killed more than 100 people. The victims had consumed bootleg whiskey and vodka that contained methanol. Investigation revealed sophisticated counterfeiting operations that were producing fake bottles of premium international brands, complete with holograms and other anti-counterfeiting features. The bottles were sold not in slums but in ordinary shops, to middle-class consumers who had no reason to suspect they were buying fake products. This represented an evolution in the illicit alcohol market. Instead of targeting the poor with obviously cheap products, counterfeiters were targeting the middle class with convincing fakes of premium brands. The profit margins were higher because premium spirits sell for much more than bottom-shelf products, and the risk of detection was lower because the customers were less likely to be monitored by authorities. It was, in a sense, a more sophisticated crime, but the results were the same: people dead, people blind, families destroyed. The Indonesian government responded by tightening import controls on industrial alcohol, by increasing penalties for counterfeiting, by conducting raids on suspected production facilities. They also launched public awareness campaigns warning people to buy alcohol only from licensed retailers, to be suspicious of unusually cheap premium brands, to look for signs of tampering with bottles. These measures reduced the immediate crisis, but didn't eliminate the underlying problem: the combination of high taxes on legal alcohol, sophisticated criminal networks, and inadequate enforcement capacity. China, despite its authoritarian government and extensive surveillance infrastructure, has struggled with similar issues. The Chinese market for premium foreign spirits, particularly cognac and whiskey, is enormous and lucrative. This has created a massive counterfeiting industry producing fake bottles that are sold both within China and exported to other Asian markets. Some of these counterfeits contain methanol, either because the counterfeiters are incompetent or because they're deliberately using the cheapest possible ingredients to maximize profit. A 2021 study by the International Alliance for Responsible Drinking estimated that counterfeit spirits account for as much as 30% of the premium spirits market in China. Not all of these counterfeits are dangerous. Some are made with actual ethanol, just not the premium spirit claimed on the label, but the percentage that contain methanol or other toxic adulterants is significant. The Chinese government periodically announces major crackdowns, arrests are made, facilities are shut down, but the counterfeiting continues because the profit potential is simply too large and the enforcement challenge too great. The Nordic countries, despite their historically strict alcohol policies, have virtually no methanol poisonings because their state monopoly systems ensure quality control and their healthcare systems can treat the rare individual cases that occur. The United Kingdom, France, Germany, other wealthy European nations with mature regulatory systems and competitive legal markets see occasional counterfeiting but rarely mass poisonings. The United States, after learning its Prohibition-era lessons, maintains relatively low spirits taxes and robust enforcement, keeping the illicit market small and methanol incidents rare. This is not to say that wealth alone solves the problem. Policy choices matter as much as wealth. A wealthy country that imposes prohibition or confiscatory taxes will create black markets regardless of its enforcement capacity. A poor country that keeps alcohol legal and moderately taxed can minimize black market activity, even with limited enforcement resources. The evidence consistently shows that the optimal policy for preventing methanol poisonings is to make legal alcohol accessible and affordable, while maintaining basic safety standards and enforcing those standards consistently. Yet this evidence-based conclusion faces powerful opposition from multiple directions. Temperance advocates argue that making alcohol more accessible increases consumption and therefore increases alcohol-related harm. Religious conservatives oppose any liberalization on moral grounds, regardless of public health evidence. In their view, alcohol consumption is sinful, and the state has a duty to discourage it, even if prohibition creates black markets and poisonings. The deaths from methanol are tragic, but are the responsibility of those who chose to break the law, not the fault of the law itself. Commercial interests also complicate reform. Legal alcohol producers benefit from high barriers to entry that keep out competition. When reformers propose lowering taxes to undercut black markets, the industry often lobbies against it because lower taxes mean lower profit margins. Government finance ministries are perhaps the most formidable obstacle. Alcohol taxes are a major revenue source in many countries, sometimes accounting for several percent of total government revenue. The path of least resistance is to maintain existing alcohol taxes regardless of their public health consequences, a calculation that values fiscal convenience over human lives. The political economy of alcohol policy thus creates a kind of trap. Evidence points towards certain reforms, moderating taxes, improving regulation, providing treatment services, but multiple powerful interests oppose those reforms for reasons that have nothing to do with public health. The result is policy stasis, and the poisonings continue, each one generating brief attention and calls for action, then fading from memory until the next outbreak. Breaking this cycle requires political leadership willing to prioritize evidence over ideology, public health over revenue maximization, long-term outcomes over short-term political convenience. Part of the answer lies in building broader public understanding of the problem. Most people in wealthy countries have no idea that methanol poisoning kills thousands annually in other parts of the world. Building awareness, making the problem visible, creating political pressure for reform. This is work that public health advocates, journalists, and international organizations can do. Another part is demonstrating that reform works. When Portugal decriminalized drugs, opponents predicted catastrophe. When New Zealand legalized home distilling, critics warned of poisoning epidemics. Neither happened. These natural experiments provide evidence that can overcome ideological objections, though only if the evidence is actually examined rather than dismissed as irrelevant to local circumstances. Technology may offer some solutions, though it's not a panacea. Rapid testing devices that can detect methanol are becoming cheaper and more portable. Blockchain tracking of alcohol production and distribution could make diversion of industrial alcohol more difficult. Mobile phone apps could allow consumers to verify authentic products. But all of these technological solutions depend on infrastructure, reliable electricity, internet connectivity, and trust that the systems aren't corrupted. In places where methanol poisoning is most common, these dependencies are often not met. Technology can help at the margins, but it cannot substitute for fundamental policy reform. The ethical dimensions of the methanol poisoning crisis deserve emphasis. These are not natural disasters or unavoidable tragedies. They are the predictable consequences of policy choices, of decisions made or not made by governments, institutions, and individuals. Every mass poisoning represents a failure of regulation, enforcement, social policy, moral imagination. The victims are disproportionately poor, disproportionately marginalized, disproportionately without political voice or power. Their deaths are preventable but unprevented because the cost of prevention exceeds what society is willing to pay. There's a kind of structural violence in this, violence not from individual malice but from systems that reliably harm certain populations while protecting others. The middle-class consumer who unknowingly buys counterfeit whiskey is a victim, but they at least have access to healthcare if poisoned. The slum dweller buying bootleg hooch has no such safety net. The poisoning is the same, but the outcome is different because of circumstances beyond individual control. As we conclude this exploration of illicit alcohol, certain themes emerge with clarity. The demand for alcohol is ancient, persistent, and arguably ineradicable. Humans have been seeking intoxication for as long as we've been human, making alcohol for at least 10,000 years. This demand will not be eliminated by prohibition or moral exhortation, no matter how well-intentioned. The supply of alcohol will always adapt to meet demand. If legal channels are blocked or too expensive, illegal channels will emerge. The market is resilient, adaptive, and responsive to profit opportunities in ways that regulatory systems struggle to match. The quality and safety of alcohol depend primarily on the regulatory environment. When production occurs in the light, subject to standards and oversight, quality is generally high and safety incidents are rare. When production is driven underground, quality varies wildly, and safety is someone else's problem. The harm from alcohol policy comes not just from alcohol itself but from the policies designed to control it. Prohibition kills through methanol poisoning and the violence of black markets. High taxation kills by making illegal alcohol economically attractive. Weak enforcement kills by allowing dangerous producers to operate. Even well-intentioned policies can backfire catastrophically if they don't account for how humans actually behave and how markets actually function. The most effective policies are those that accept these realities rather than fighting them. Make alcohol legal and affordable, so the price gap between legal and illegal is small. Regulate production rigorously enough to ensure safety, but not so strictly that compliance is impractical. Enforce the rules consistently, so that cheating doesn't pay. Provide treatment for people with alcohol problems. Address the social conditions, poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity, that make dangerous drinking attractive in the first place. These principles are straightforward, but their implementation is politically and practically challenging. They require sustained investment of resources, political courage to defend evidence-based policies against ideological attacks, administrative capacity to regulate effectively, and acceptance of alcohol consumption as a social reality rather than a problem to be eliminated. Not every country is ready or able to implement such policies, but those that do consistently see better outcomes. The question facing us now, in 2025, as we look at the contemporary global methanol crisis, is whether we'll apply what we know. The evidence is clear, the solutions are available. What's lacking is not knowledge or capability, but will. The political will to prioritize public health over revenue or ideology. The institutional will to implement and sustain effective policies. The social will to accept that some problems can't be eliminated entirely, but only managed more or less well. The people dying from methanol poisoning today are not abstractions or statistics, they're individuals with names, families, hopes, histories. The farmer in rural India, who wanted a drink after a hard day's work. The woman in Tehran, who took a shot at a wedding. The teenager in Nairobi, trying alcohol for the first time. The father in Jakarta, who bought what he thought was safe whiskey for a celebration. Each death is a tragedy, each blindness a life fundamentally altered, each family a circle of grief radiating outward. These tragedies are preventable. Not every single one. Human systems are imperfect, and some risk is inevitable, but the vast majority could be prevented if we chose to prevent them. The fact that we haven't made that choice, that the poisonings continue year after year, outbreak after outbreak, says something about our priorities as a global community. It says that some lives are valued less than others. It says that ideological commitments matter more than body counts, but it doesn't have to be this way. Policy can change, markets can be redirected, lives can be saved. What's required is acknowledging that current approaches are failing, accepting that evidence should guide policy rather than ideology, and committing the resources and political capital needed to implement better approaches. This is not impossible. It's not even unprecedented. It's been done before in various places and contexts. It can be done again. The complete history of illicit alcohol is ultimately a story about human nature, about our desires and our failings, about how we organize societies and how those societies succeed or fail to protect the vulnerable. It's a story about chemistry and economics, about culture and power, about the distance between intentions and outcomes. It's a story that continues to unfold, chapter by chapter, crisis by crisis, death by preventable death. The question is whether we'll learn from the long bloody history we've examined, or whether we'll continue repeating the same mistakes, expecting different results, while people keep going blind, and keep dying from a poison we know how to identify, know how to avoid, but somehow cannot prevent from entering the supply of one of humanity's oldest and most problematic pleasures. That is where we are, as the story continues. That is the history we are making right now, in this moment, with consequences that will echo through the lives of people not yet born, in communities not yet affected, in crises not yet unfolded. The history of illicit alcohol is not over. It's not even close to over, but it could be different, better, less deadly, more humane. If we choose to make it so, the choice as it has always been, is ours. And with that sobering thought, we close this long dark history. The lights can come back on. You can pick up your phone. The world returns, with all its complexity and contradiction, its dangers and possibilities, its preventable tragedies, and its unrealized potential for doing better. Thank you for staying with this difficult story. Sleep well, if you can. And tomorrow perhaps, we can begin the work of writing a different history, one where knowledge leads to action, where evidence shapes policy, where fewer people die from poisons we know how to avoid. Good night.